the mafia boss's baby wouldn't stop crying on the plane until a single mother did the unthinkable. The cabin of the red-eye flight from New York to Harbor City was a pressurized tube of recycled air, exhaustion, and impatience. For Grace Collins, sitting in seat 24A, the drone of the engine sounded exactly like her own internal monologue, a looping track of anxiety and defeat. She pressed her forehead against the cool plastic of the window shade, trying to block out the world. It had been another wasted trip, another draining round in family court where her ex-husband, Calvin, had sat with his polished lawyer, smirking while the judge lectured Grace on financial stability. She had lost the motion to modify the visitation schedule again. She was flying home to an empty apartment, her bank account overdrawn by $300, and her heart aching for her 5-year-old son, Ethan, who was currently staying with her mother. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean of hope, just a tired woman in a faded cardigan trying to make it through the night, across the aisle, in the row ahead of her. The atmosphere was different. It was heavy, radiating a tension that had nothing to do with the turbulence. A man sat there. He was impossible to miss, even in the dimly lit cabin. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Grace made in a year, charcoal gray, tailored to perfection, stretching tight across broad shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of the world. His dark hair was cut ruthlessly short, and his profile was sharp, severe, and devastatingly handsome. But it was what was strapped to his chest that drew the eye. A baby carrier. Inside it was an infant, small and thrashing, his face contorted in a scream that had been shredding the peace of the cabin for the last 20 minutes. Dominic Moretti, known in the shadowed alleys of Harbor City as the head of the Moretti crime family, looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. His large hands, usually steady when holding a gun or signing a death warrant, were clumsy as they patted the baby's back. He was stiff, his posture rigid. He wasn't just annoyed, he was terrified. The grief of losing Sophia, the baby's mother, was still a fresh, gaping wound in his chest, and now holding their son Mateo. Dom felt a kind of helplessness he had never experienced in his 34 years of life. The baby let out a high, piercing shriek that cut through the low hum of the Boeing. A collective groan rippled through the economy section. "Can't you keep him quiet?" A man in a business suit 3 rows back snapped, not bothering to lower his voice. Dom's jaw tightened, a muscle feathered near his temple. He didn't turn around. If he turned around, the violence that lived just beneath his skin might spill out, and he could not afford a scene. Not here. Not with Mateo. The crying escalated, a jagged, wet sound of pure distress. Grace lifted her head. She watched the man across the aisle. She didn't see a mafia boss. She didn't see the expensive watch or the 2 large, blocky men sitting in the row behind him who were glaring at the complaining passengers with lethal intent. She saw a father drowning. She recognized the specific, hollowed-out look in his eyes when he turned slightly to check the diaper bag. It was the panic of a new parent who realizes they are completely alone. It was the look of someone who had run out of answers. Empathy, sharp and sudden, pierced through Grace's own exhaustion. She knew that feeling. She remembered the nights Ethan had screamed until dawn, the isolation, the feeling that she was failing at the one job that mattered. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The click was loud in the quiet lull between screams. Grace stood up. Her legs were shaky from lack of food, but she smoothed her skirt and stepped into the aisle. The 2 men behind Dom, his bodyguards, shifted instantly. One of them, a man with a scar running through his eyebrow, started to rise, his hand moving inside his jacket. Grace ignored him. She focused entirely on Dom. "Excuse me," she said softly. Dom looked up. His eyes were the color of obsidian, cold and guarded. For a second, Grace felt a chill run down her spine. There was something dangerous about him, an aura of command that made the air feel thin. But beneath the ice, she saw the desperation. He didn't speak. He just stared at her, his hand protectively cupping the baby's head. "I couldn't help but notice," Grace said, keeping her voice low and non-threatening. "He sounds like his ears might be popping. The pressure change on descent can be brutal for them." "Do you have a bottle?" Dom blinked. the aggression fading slightly, replaced by confusion. "I tried. He won't take it." Grace nodded sympathetically. "He's probably too worked up to latch on." Sometimes you have to distract them first. Before Dom could respond, a woman in the aisle seat 2 rows forward turned around. Her face was pinched and sour. "For God's sake," she hissed, "some of us have work in the morning. If you can't control your kid, you shouldn't be flying. It is selfish." The cabin erupted in a murmur of agreement. Someone pressed a call button aggressively. Dom's head snapped toward the woman. His eyes narrowed into slits. The air around him seemed to darken. Grace saw his hand clench into a fist on the armrest, the knuckles turning white. He was 2 seconds away from doing something that would get them all arrested. Then the flight attendant arrived. She was flushed and harried, her patience clearly worn thin. "Sir," she said, her voice tight and professional but devoid of warmth, "you need to calm the child down. Passengers are complaining. I am trying." Dom grounded out, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. "Well, try harder," the attendant said, crossing her arms, "or I will have to ask the captain to have security meet us at the gate. We've had complaints about his crying since takeoff. It is a disturbance." Security. The word hung in the air like a threat. Grace saw Dom stiffen. He couldn't have security. He couldn't have police checking his ID, running his name, looking too closely at the men traveling with him. He was Dominic Moretti. Police scrutiny meant disaster. Something inside Grace snapped. It was the unfairness of it, the lack of mercy. She stepped between the flight attendant and Dom, placing herself directly in the line of fire. "Are you serious?" Grace asked, her voice rising, clear and firm. The attendant blinked, surprised by the intervention. "Excuse me, miss. This doesn't concern... It concerns anyone with a heart," Grace interrupted, turning to face the cabin. She looked at the woman who had complained, then at the businessman, and finally back at the attendant. "Look at him. He's exhausted. The baby is in pain. Have none of you ever had a bad day? Have none of you ever been small and scared and unable to tell anyone what hurt?" The cabin went silent. "He's doing his best," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion but holding strong. "You are shaming a father who is clearly grieving and trying to comfort his son. Instead of threatening him with security, maybe you could offer him a glass of water or some compassion." The flight attendant's face went pink. She opened her mouth, closed it, and took a step back. "Just keep the noise down," the attendant muttered, retreating toward the galley. Grace let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She turned back to Dom. He was looking at her as if she were a mythological creature that had just materialized out of the clouds. The aggression was gone, replaced by a stunned, raw gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy. "Don't mention it," Grace whispered. "People can be awful." Suddenly, the plane lurched. A violent shudder ripped through the frame as they hit a pocket of rough air. The seatbelt sign pinged on with an urgent chime. Drinks slid off trays. A few passengers gasped. Grace stumbled, grabbing the back of Dom's empty aisle seat to steady herself. As she righted herself, her eyes darted down the aisle. Several rows back, a man in a nondescript beige jacket had unbuckled his seatbelt. He was standing up, moving toward them with a focused, predatory intensity. He wasn't a passenger going to the bathroom. He was moving with training. Grace saw his eyes lock onto Dom. She saw the subtle bulge at his hip. An air marshal. He must have recognized Dom. Maybe from a briefing, maybe from the news. But he was coming over. And with the tension already high, the turbulence, and Dom's agitated bodyguards, this was a powder keg waiting for a match. Dom saw him too. His body went rigid, his hand dropping from the baby to the inside of his jacket. No, Grace thought. No guns. Not here. Not with the baby. She didn't think. She just moved. Grace slipped into the empty seat beside Dom, sliding into the narrow space between him and the window. "Give him to me," she whispered urgently. "What?" Dom looked at her, confused. The marshal was 10 feet away. Grace reached out and unclipped the carrier, her hands moving fast. "Trust me." Dom hesitated for a fraction of a second, then surrendered the screaming bundle to her. Grace pulled Mateo into her arms, cradling him against her chest. She leaned into Dom, pressing her shoulder firmly against his, creating a tableau of intimacy. As the air marshal reached their row, Grace looked up, her eyes bright and wide. She reached out and wrapped her free arm through Dom's, clutching his bicep. "Shh! It is okay," she said loudly, addressing the baby but pitching her voice for the marshal. "Daddy is just stressed. Sweetie, we're almost home." She looked at the marshal, offering a tired, apologetic smile. "I am so sorry, officer," she said. "Our son has an ear infection. My husband is terrified of flying, and the baby picks up on his nerves. We are doing our best." The air marshal stopped. He looked at Dom, whose face was now partially obscured by Grace's leaning form. He looked at Grace, who looked like every other exhausted mother he had ever seen. He looked at the baby, who was still whimpering but settling into the new warmth. The tension in the marshal's shoulders dropped. The narrative changed in his head. This wasn't a mob boss traveling with muscle. This was a stressed family unit. "Sir," the marshal said to Dom, his tone cautious but less confrontational. "Please keep your seatbelt fastened. It is getting rough." "I will," Dom said. His voice was steady, but Grace could feel the rapid hammering of his heart against her arm. The marshal nodded once, cast a suspicious glance at the bodyguards behind them, who were now looking studiously at their phones, and turned back to his seat. Grace didn't let go. She kept her arm looped through Dom's, her body heat seeping into his expensive suit. She looked down at Mateo. The baby was red-faced, his little fists bunching the fabric of Grace's cardigan. Grace shifted her hold, bringing his head into the crook of her neck. She began to rock, a rhythmic, gentle sway that came from muscle memory. She hummed. It was a low, vibrating sound, a lullaby she used to sing to Ethan when the thunderstorms rolled in off the Atlantic. She rubbed the small circle of Mateo's back, her palm warm and sure. "Shh, shh, little one," she murmured, pressing her cheek to the downy, soft hair on his head. "You are safe. You are okay." Mateo hiccuped. He let out one last indignant cry, and then, miraculously, he quieted. His breathing hitched, slowed, and deepened. The screaming stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. Dom sat frozen. He watched Grace's hands, rough from waitressing, nails short and unpainted, as they soothed his son. He watched the way she tucked the blanket around Mateo's feet. He watched the curve of her jaw as she rested her head against the seat back, her eyes fluttering closed. For months, Dom had felt cold. Since the funeral, since the endless meetings, since the threats started coming in from the Valente family, he'd been living in a winter of his own making. But the woman beside him was warm. The cabin lights dimmed further as the captain announced their final descent. The plane leveled out, cutting through the clouds. Grace opened her eyes and found Dom staring at her. They were inches apart. In the cramped economy seat, there was nowhere to go. Her arm was still wrapped around his. She started to pull away, realizing how presumptuous she had been. But Dom shifted his arm, trapping her hand against his bicep. He didn't hold her aggressively. He held her like he was afraid she would vanish if he let go. "Thank you," he said again. The words were quiet, meant only for her. "She saved you," Grace whispered, answering the unasked question about the marshal. "He recognized you." "I know," Dom said. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then back up to her eyes. "You took a big risk for a stranger." "You didn't look like a stranger," Grace admitted, her voice trembling. "You just looked like a dad who needed a break." Dom looked down at Mateo, who was now fast asleep, drooling slightly on Grace's collarbone. "My son, he hasn't slept like that in weeks, not since his mother passed." The grief in his voice was so raw it made Grace's chest ache. She reached out with her free hand, her fingers brushing over Dom's knuckles where they gripped the armrest. It was an instinctive gesture of comfort, but the moment skin touched skin, the air between them changed. It wasn't just comfort. It was a spark, a shock of awareness that traveled up her arm and settled low in her stomach. Dom turned his hand over, catching her fingers. His palm was rough, calloused, swallowing her smaller hand. He didn't shake it. He just held it. They sat there as the plane descended toward Harbor City, the lights of the skyline rising to meet them. Two strangers, bound by a lie and a sleeping baby, holding hands in the dark. Grace felt a confusing, magnetic pull toward him. He was dangerous. She knew that. The bodyguards, the expensive suit, the air marshal's reaction, it all screamed danger. But looking at the way he looked at his son, she didn't want to run away. She wanted to lean in. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud. The spell broke. Grace gently pulled her hand away. Dom let her go, but reluctantly. The lights flickered on, harsh and bright, washing out the intimacy of the shadows. As the plane taxied to the gate, the frantic energy of arrival took over. Seatbelts clicked open. Bags were pulled from overhead bins. Grace carefully transferred the sleeping Mateo back into Dom's arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Dom held him differently now, more securely, with more confidence. Grace gathered her purse, suddenly feeling shy. The bravado of the our son lie had evaporated, leaving her feeling exposed. "I should go," she said, edging toward the aisle. "Wait." Dom stood up. Blocking her path, he loomed over her, tall and imposing, taking up all the space in the row. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sleek card case. He extracted a card. It was black metal, heavy and cool to the touch, with gold lettering. Dominic Moretti, it read, and a number. No title, no company name. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her hand. His fingers lingered on her palm. "If you ever need anything at all, you call me?" Grace looked at the card, then up at him. "I really didn't do it for a reward. Mr. Moretti." Dom's eyes burned into hers. "I know. That is why I am giving it to you." He stepped back, allowing her to pass. Grace walked quickly up the jet bridge, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She navigated the terminal in a daze, the metal card burning a hole in her pocket. Outside, the harbor city air was cold and smelled of salt and exhaust. Grace walked toward the rideshare pickup zone, pulling her thin cardigan tighter around herself. She checked her phone. Her ride was a rusted sedan, 5 minutes away, 50 yards down the curb. A convoy of 3 black SUVs idled. Grace stopped. She looked over. Dom was standing by the open door of the middle vehicle. His bodyguards were scanning the perimeter, hands near their waistbands. Dom wasn't looking at them. He was looking at her. Across the swirling chaos of the pickup lane, their eyes met one last time. Grace stood by the curb, clutching her cheap purse, her hair messy from the flight. Dom stood in the halo of the streetlights, powerful and terrifying and wealthy beyond comprehension. They were from different worlds, universes apart, but as Dom finally ducked into the car and the heavy door slammed shut, Grace felt a strange sinking feeling in her gut. It wasn't relief that she had escaped a dangerous situation. It was a terrifying premonition. She had the distinct, unshakable feeling that she hadn't just met a stranger on a plane. She had just walked into the rest of her life, and she wasn't sure if she would survive it. The smell of Harbor City was different from New York. It smelled of brine and old asphalt, but for Grace Collins, the defining scent of home was the cloying, humid aroma of industrial detergent rising from the laundromat downstairs. She keyed into her apartment, the lock sticking twice before it gave way. Inside, the space was cramped and dim, illuminated only by the street lamp outside the window. But the moment she stepped across the threshold, a small, warm body hurtled into her legs. "Mommy!" Grace dropped her bag and fell to her knees, scooping up her 5-year-old son, Ethan. He smelled like cheap shampoo and peanut butter, the best smell in the world. She buried her face in his neck, breathing him in, letting the crushing weight of the failed court hearing in New York dissolve for just a second. "Hey, superhero," she whispered, her voice tight. "Were you good for Grandma?" "I drew you a picture," Ethan said, pulling back to look at her with wide, trusting eyes. "It is a rocket ship. So we can go to the moon." Grace forced a smile, though her chest ached. "That sounds perfect, baby." Her mother, Linda, stood in the kitchenette doorway, drying her hands on a rag. She looked tired, her graying hair pulled back in a loose bun. She didn't ask how the mediation went. She didn't have to. Grace's slumped shoulders and the red rimming her eyes told the whole story. "He didn't show up, did he?" Linda asked softly after Ethan had run off to fetch his drawing. "He sent his lawyer," Grace said, standing up and walking to the counter. "The lawyer said my income is unstable. They are pushing for primary custody again. Mom, they want to take him." She looked down at the counter. There was a pile of envelopes there, menacing in their silence. "Final notice. Past due. Urgent. I picked up an extra shift at the diner tonight," Grace said, turning away from the bills before she could start crying again. "It starts in an hour." "You just got off a plane." "Grace," her mother said, concern etching deep lines into her forehead. "You are exhausted. I need the money," Grace said simply. The diner was a fluorescent-lit box of misery on the corner of 4th and Main. It was the kind of place where the coffee was burnt. The floor was always slightly sticky, and the customers felt entitled to treat the staff like furniture. Grace tied her apron tight, trying to hold herself together. Her feet were throbbing from the flight and the walk home, but she moved with practiced efficiency. She poured coffee. She balanced plates of greasy eggs, and she dodged the wandering hands of the late-night crowd. "Hey, Gracie," a voice slurred from the corner booth. Grace stiffened. It was relentless. Gary, he was a regular. A man who thought buying a $3 cup of coffee bought him the right to leer. "Can I get you a refill, Gary?" Grace asked, keeping the pot between them like a shield. "I don't want coffee," Gary grinned. His teeth yellowed. "I want a smile. You are always so serious. Come on, honey, sit down for a minute. I am working." "Gary," Grace said, moving to step away. He reached out, his fingers brushing her hip. "Just 1 minute." Grace sidestepped him, her skin crawling, and retreated behind the counter. She tallied her tips on a napkin. $12. She needed $3,000 for the retainer fee on a decent lawyer. The math was a black hole, sucking her in. At 1 a.m, the bell above the door chimed. It wasn't the usual tinny jingle. It sounded louder, sharper in the sudden silence that descended on the room. Grace looked up from the register. A black car, sleek and predatory, was idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the diner's foggy window. The door opened, and 3 men walked in. The atmosphere in the diner changed instantly. It was as if the air pressure had dropped. The cook, usually loud and banging pans, went silent, peeking nervously through the pass-through window. 2 of the men were large, wearing dark suits that fit too well to be off the rack. They moved with the synchronized grace of apex predators, scanning the room before flanking the door. Between them walked Dominic Moretti. He looked out of place among the peeling vinyl seats and the smell of old fryer grease, and he was wearing a fresh suit, navy blue this time, and he looked impeccable, except for the shadows under his eyes and the infant carrier strapped to his chest. Grace's pulse spiked. She felt a flush of heat rise up her neck, a mix of embarrassment at being seen in her stained uniform and a jolt of recognition that hit her lower belly. Dom saw her immediately. He didn't look at the menu or the other customers. He walked straight to the counter. "Grace," he said. His voice was a low rumble, deeper than the hum of the refrigerator. "Mr. "Moretti," Grace said, wiping her hands on her apron. What are you doing here?" "I tracked the flight manifest," Dom said, as if that were a normal thing people did. "I needed to find you." He looked exhausted. The polished veneer of the mafia boss was cracking around the edges. He looked down at the carrier. "He's been screaming for 2 hours," Dom confessed, his voice laced with defeat. "I fed him. I changed him. I walked the floor. My housekeeper tried. My guards tried. Nothing works." Mateo let out a fussing whimper, the prelude to a full-blown meltdown. Grace didn't hesitate. She forgot the diner, the staring customers, and the exhaustion dragging at her bones. She walked around the counter. "Here," she said softly. "Let me take him." Dom unclipped the carrier with fumbling fingers. As soon as Grace lifted Mateo into her arms, the baby stiffened, then slumped against her shoulder. She began the sway, that instinctive, rhythmic movement of a mother. She patted his back, humming the same low note she had used on the plane. Within seconds, the whimpering stopped. Mateo let out a long, shuddering sigh and buried his face in the crook of her neck. Dom watched her. mesmerized. He looked like a man witnessing a miracle. "I don't understand," he murmured, leaning against the counter, his posture relaxing for the first time since he walked in. "He hates everyone, except you." "He doesn't hate everyone," Grace said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. The neon sign in the window cast a soft pink glow over her face, hiding the dark circles under her eyes. "He's just grieving. Babies feel loss. Dom, he knows things are different. He needs to feel safe." Dom looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the fraying hem of her apron, the fatigue in her posture, and the way she held his son as if he were the most precious thing in the room. "I am drowning, Grace," Dom said quietly. It was a confession he wouldn't have made to his priest, let alone a waitress in a diner. But something about her stripped his defenses away. Sophia, she handled everything, the house, the baby. "I run a demanding family business. I deal with difficult people. I don't know how to do this part." Grace looked up at him. His eyes were dark pools of pain. She shifted Mateo to her other hip. "You are learning," she said gently. "You just need a crash course. Maybe less glaring, more singing." A corner of Dom's mouth quirked up, an almost smile. "I don't sing. You might have to learn," Grace teased. "Hey!" The shout shattered the moment. Grace flinched. Gary had stumbled up from his booth. He swayed on his feet, his face red with drunk indignation. He pointed a shaking finger at Grace. "I have been waiting for a refill for 10 minutes, he shouted, "and you are over here chatting up some suit?" Grace's face burned. "Gary, please, I will be right there. No, you will be right here." Gary lunged forward. He grabbed Grace's wrist, his grip wet and hard. "You come serve me, sweetheart." The world seemed to stop. Grace tried to pull back, fear spiking in her chest, but Gary held on. Then a shadow fell over them. Dom didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He simply stepped into Gary's personal space. He moved with a fluidity that was terrifying to behold. He placed one hand on the counter, leaning in close to Gary's face. "Let go of her," Dom said. The voice was barely a whisper. It was calm. It was flat. It was the sound of a tomb closing. Gary blinked, his drunken haze piercing for a second. He looked up at Dom. He looked at the two large men by the door who had taken a step forward, their jackets unbuttoned. Dom's eyes were dead. There was no anger in them, only a promise of violence so absolute it made the air in the diner turn cold. "If you ever touch her again," Dom said, enunciating every word, "you will never touch anything again." "Do you understand me?" Gary's face went pale. He released Grace's wrist as if it were red-hot iron. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. I didn't mean nothing," Gary stammered. He threw a crumpled bill on the table and scrambled for the door, practically running past the bodyguards to get into the night. Grace rubbed her wrist. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She looked at Dom. The father was gone. The predator was back. She realized then, truly, who he was. This wasn't just a wealthy businessman. This was a man who commanded fear the way other men commanded dogs. "Are you all right?" Dom asked, the ice leaving his eyes as he turned back to her. "I am fine," Grace said, her voice shaking. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Dom said firmly. 20 minutes later. Grace's shift ended. She walked out the back door, hugging her coat around herself. The alley was dark, but a sleek black shape was waiting at the curb. Dom rolled down the window as she walked toward the sidewalk. "Get in," he said. "I will drive you home." "I can walk," Grace said. "It is 2 a.m. "Grace, get in." She hesitated, then opened the back door. The interior smelled of leather and expensive cologne. Mateo was asleep in his car seat next to her. As the car glided through the silent streets of Harbor City, Dom turned in the front passenger seat to look at her. "I have a proposition for you," he said. Grace looked up, wary. "A proposition?" "I want you to come live at the estate," Dom said. He said it like he was closing a deal. "I want you to be Mateo's nanny. Full-time, live-in." Grace laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Mr. Moretti, I have a job. I have a son. I can't just—" "I will pay you $10,000 a month," Dom cut in. Grace's mouth snapped shut. 10,000. That was more than she made in 6 months. Plus room and board. Dom continued. full medical, and protection. I can't trust strangers with him, Grace. I have enemies, people who would use my son to get to me. But on that plane, he chose you, and you protected him. You stood up to the crew. You stood up to the marshal. You have fight in you." Grace looked at the sleeping baby. The offer was a lifeline. It was salvation, but it was also a deal with the devil. "I can't," she whispered, "my son. Ethan needs stability. I can't bring him into your world. I know what you are. Dom, I saw it in the diner." Dom's expression tightened. "You would be safe. Safer than you are here." "No," Grace said, reaching for the door handle as the car pulled up to the laundromat. "Thank you for the ride, but no." The apartment was quiet when she got in, but her mother was sitting up at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea. Grace sat down opposite her and put her head in her hands. She told her mother everything. The diner, the rescue, the offer. $10,000? Linda repeated, her eyes widening. "I said no. Grace said, 'Mom, he is dangerous. He is the mob.'" "Grace, look around you," Linda said, her voice sharp. "Look at these walls. Look at those bills. Calvin's lawyer called again while you were at work. They are filing an emergency motion for custody on Monday. They are going to say you can't provide a suitable home." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "Monday? If you lose Ethan, does it matter how safe you are?" Linda asked gently. "And that man? You say he is dangerous, but he drove across the city because his baby was crying. He fought for his son tonight. I have never seen Calvin fight for anything but his own ego." Grace stared at the table. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. It was a text from Calvin. "Hope you're enjoying the laundromat. Gracie. My lawyer says the judge is going to love your current living situation. Say goodbye to Ethan. I am taking him full time." Grace stared at the screen until the words blurred. A sob ripped itself out of her throat. She ran into the tiny bathroom and locked the door, sliding down to the cold tile floor. She couldn't lose Ethan. She would die first. She sat there, shaking, the walls closing in on her. She thought of Dom's eyes in the diner. "Safer than you are here." With trembling fingers, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the black metal card. It felt heavy, substantial. She dialed the number. It rang once. "Moretti." Dom's voice answered. "Alert! Awake! It is Grace," she whispered. There was a pause. Then, the tension in his voice softened. "Grace, I need—" Grace swallowed hard, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "We need to talk." The cafe Dom chose the next day was in the upscale district, a place with white tablecloths and hushed conversations. They sat at a corner table. Far from the windows, Dom looked different in the daylight, less like a shadow, more like a man carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. He watched her as she read the contract he had placed on the table. "I added a clause for Ethan," Dom said, pointing to a paragraph. "He gets his own room. You have the entire east wing of the guest house. It is private. You can enroll him in the private school nearby. I will cover the tuition." Grace looked at the numbers. It was generous. Obscenely generous. "And the legal support?" she asked, her voice steady despite her nerves. "My personal attorney, Elena Vance, will handle your custody case," Dom said. "She has never lost. Calvin won't know what hit him." Grace looked up at him. "Why? Why do this for me?" Dom leaned forward. His hand rested on the table, inches from hers. "Because last night was the first time I slept in 3 months." He said, "Because when you are holding Mateo, I don't feel like I'm about to crash." Grace looked into his eyes. She saw the loneliness there, a mirror of her own. She saw a man who was surrounded by soldiers, but had no one to stand beside him. "I have rules," Grace said. "No violence around the boys. No business in the house when they are awake. And I am not anything but the nanny." "Agreed," Dom said, serious. "Strictly professional." He slid a pen toward her. Grace picked it up. She signed her name, Grace Collins. As she pushed the paper back to him, her hand brushed his. It was accidental, a fleeting contact of fingertips. Dom didn't pull away. He froze. Grace felt a jolt of electricity shoot up her arm, hotter and sharper than the night before. She looked up, startled. and found Dom staring at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a second, the cafe faded away. It was just the two of them, their hands touching over a contract that bound their lives together. The tension was thick, palpable, a mixture of fear and a sudden, terrifying attraction. "Thank you," Grace whispered, pulling her hand back slowly. Dom cleared his throat, breaking the spell. He picked up the contract, his movements slightly stiff. "Pack your things, Grace," he said, his voice rougher than before. "We leave in an hour." Grace nodded, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She had just sold her soul to the devil to save her son. But as she looked at Dom, watching him carefully fold the paper, she wondered if the real danger wasn't the violence of his world, but the way he made her feel like she finally belonged somewhere. The iron gates of the Moretti estate swung open with a heavy, mechanical groan that vibrated through the chassis of the black SUV. Grace Collins sat in the back seat, her hand gripping the leather armrest so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Beside her, 5-year-old Ethan had his face pressed against the tinted glass, his breath fogging the window as he stared out in open-mouthed wonder. "Wow," he breathed, the sound small in the quiet cabin. "Is this a castle? Mommy? It certainly looked like one." The estate was a fortress disguised as a paradise. High stone walls, easily 12 feet tall, were topped with decorative spikes that looked elegant from a distance but lethal up close. Security cameras swiveled silently on black mounts, their lenses tracking the vehicle's approach. Men in dark suits stood at the perimeter, their postures rigid, hands clasped in front of them but ready to move. Grace felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. This was not just a home, it was a compound. Inside the walls, the atmosphere shifted abruptly. The menacing security gave way to manicured lawns that stretched out like green velvet carpets. Weeping willows draped over a sparkling pond, and a driveway lined with ancient oak trees led up to a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion bathed in the warm, golden light of the late afternoon. The car stopped beneath a stone portico. A driver opened the door, and Grace stepped out, pulling Ethan close to her side. He clung to her leg, intimidated by the sheer scale of the massive oak front doors and the silence that hung over the property. Dom was waiting for them in the foyer. The space was flooded with sunlight from a domed skylight, illuminating a grand staircase that swept upward in a graceful curve. "Welcome home," Dom said. He looked different here than he had in the diner. He wasn't wearing a jacket. His tie was loosened, and his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man trying to figure out how to live in his own house. "Thank you," Grace said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "It is incredible." A woman in a crisp uniform appeared from a hallway. "This is Elena, our head housekeeper," Dom introduced. "She will show you to your wing. Take your time settling in. I will be in the nursery with Mateo." Grace nodded, watching him walk away. He moved with a heavy tread, his shoulders slumped. Elena led them up the stairs and down a long, quiet corridor. "This is the East Wing," she explained warmly. "It is entirely yours." She opened a set of double doors. Grace gasped. The suite was larger than her entire apartment. The colors were soft creams and blues, the furniture plush and inviting. A massive window looked out over the city skyline. Harbor City glittering in the distance like a scattering of diamonds. Through a connecting door was Ethan's room. It had a bed shaped like a race car, shelves stocked with books, and a view of the garden. Ethan let go of Grace's leg and ran inside. "Whoa," he shouted, launching himself onto the mattress. "It is super bouncy." Grace watched him laugh, a sound she hadn't heard enough of lately. She should have felt relieved. She was safe. Her son had a soft bed and a safe yard, but the knot in her stomach remained. She looked at the heavy silk curtains and the thick carpet. It felt like a golden cage. Had she sold her soul for high thread count sheets and a security team? She pushed the thought away. She was doing this for Ethan. An hour later, Grace found the nursery. It was the warmest room in the house, painted a soft sage green, with a mobile of wooden stars rotating slowly above the crib. Dom was sitting in a rocking chair, holding Mateo. He looked uncomfortable, holding the baby a little too far away from his body, as if Mateo were a bomb that might explode. Mateo was fussing, turning his head frantically. "He's hungry," Dom said, looking up as Grace entered, "but he keeps spitting out the bottle." Grace smiled, her anxiety easing as she stepped into her element. "Here," she said gently, "you are holding him too flat. Gravity is working against you." She walked over and knelt beside the chair. "Sit him up a little more," she instructed, her hands hovering near his but not touching. "Support his neck with the crook of your elbow, like this." Dom adjusted his grip, his movements stiff. "Like this?" Grace reached out and gently nudged his arm higher. "Relax your shoulder. Dom, he can feel your tension. If you are stressed, he is stressed. Take a deep breath." Dom closed his eyes and inhaled deeply through his nose. He let it out slowly. His shoulders dropped an inch. Grace guided the bottle to Mateo's lips. "Tickle his lip with the nipple first," she whispered. "Wait for him to open." Mateo opened his mouth and latched on, drinking greedily. The frantic fussing stopped instantly, replaced by the rhythmic sound of swallowing. Dom let out a breath of pure relief. "I thought he was broken," he muttered. "He's not broken." Grace laughed softly. "He's just new." "And so are you." Mateo, sated and sleepy, reached up with a tiny hand, his fingers curled around Dom's silk tie, yanking it toward his mouth. Dom looked down, startled. "Hey, that is Italian silk. Little man." Grace chuckled. "He doesn't care about the label. He just knows it is yours." Dom looked at her. The harsh lines of his face softened. A genuine, unguarded smile broke across his features, transforming him from the intimidating figure on the plane into something younger, brighter. "I guess he has expensive taste," Dom said, his voice warm. Grace felt a sudden, sharp twinge in her chest. It was the same feeling she had on the plane, that magnetic pull. Seeing him smile like that, seeing the love in his eyes as he looked at his son, made it very hard to remember he was a dangerous man. That evening, the house was quiet. Ethan was asleep in his race car bed, exhausted from the excitement. Grace wandered downstairs, following the smell of burning garlic. She found Dom in the massive, industrial-style kitchen. He was standing over a skillet, a knife in one hand and a bewildered expression on his face. Smoke was rising from a pan of blackened onions. "Everything okay?" Grace asked from the doorway. Dom jumped, nearly dropping the knife. He turned, looking sheepish. "I told the staff to go home early. I thought I could make pasta. It seemed simple in theory." Grace walked over and peered into the pan. "I think you murdered the onions," she noted dryly. "It is a family tradition," Dom deadpanned. "Moretti men are great at eating, terrible at cooking." Grace laughed, taking the spatula from his hand. "Move over before you set the fire alarm off." She took charge effortlessly. She scraped the burnt onions into the trash, found a fresh onion, and started chopping. The rhythm of the knife against the wooden board was familiar and soothing. Dom didn't leave. He leaned his hip against the counter just a few feet away, crossing his arms over his chest. He watched her. Grace could feel his gaze on the side of her face. It made her skin prickle with awareness. "You are good at that," he observed. "Waitressing paid the bills," Grace said, tossing the diced onion into a fresh pan with olive oil. "But I learned to cook from my grandmother. She said food was the only language that everyone understood." Dom was silent for a moment. "My mother used to say that. She would spend all Sunday making sauce. The whole house smelled like basil and tomatoes." Grace looked at him. His eyes were distant, lost in memory. It was the first time he had mentioned his family outside of the business. She stirred the sauce she was doctoring, tasting it. It needed salt. She added a pinch, then dipped a clean spoon in. "Taste this," she said, turning to him. She held the spoon out. Dom leaned forward. He didn't take the spoon from her. He just opened his mouth, letting her feed him. Grace's hand was steady, but her heart stuttered. As he took the sauce, his lips brushed the metal, and his eyes locked onto hers. "Better?" she asked, her voice sounding breathless to her own ears. "Much better," Dom said softly. He reached out to take the spoon from her, and his fingers grazed hers. The contact was brief, but it felt like a static shock. They both froze. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt heavy, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm brewing outside. Grace pulled her hand back, turning quickly to the stove. I will just let that simmer," she stammered. Dom didn't say anything, but when she glanced back, he was still watching her, his expression unreadable and intense. The house settled into a deep silence as night fell. Grace lay in her luxurious bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The events of the last 2 days played on a loop in her mind. At 2 a.m, the cry started. It was Mateo. Grace was out of bed before she was fully awake. She grabbed her robe and hurried down the hall to the nursery. Dom was already there. He was shirtless, wearing only low-slung pajama pants, his hair messy from sleep. He was pacing the floor with Mateo, who was wailing. "He won't settle," Dom whispered, sounding desperate. Grace moved into the room, her eyes adjusted to the dim light of the moon lamp, seeing Dom half naked, his chest defined by muscle and scarred in a few places, made her falter for a step. He looked raw, powerful, and incredibly human. "Give him to me," Grace said softly. "You get the bottle warmer." They moved around each other in a quiet, synchronized dance. Grace took the baby, beginning her sway. Dom moved to the warmer, preparing the milk. He brought it to her, checking the temperature on his wrist without being told. Grace sat in the rocker, feeding Mateo. Dom didn't leave. He stood behind the chair, his hand resting on the back of it, watching them. As Mateo finished and drifted off, Grace stood up to burp him. She swayed slightly, fatigue washing over her. Dom stepped closer. He placed a hand on her back to steady her. "You are exhausted," he murmured. "So are you," Grace whispered. She leaned back slightly, her shoulder resting against his bare chest. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was gravity. Dom didn't pull away. He brought his other hand up to cup her arm, creating a protective circle around her and the baby. They stood there in the semi-darkness. The only sound, the rhythmic breathing of the child. Grace could feel the steady thump of Dom's heart against her shoulder blade. She smelled the soap on his skin and the warmth of his body. For the first time in years, Dom felt the crushing weight of his isolation lift. He wasn't alone in the dark. Someone was sharing the burden. It was a powerful, intoxicating comfort. They didn't go back to bed immediately. Mateo was asleep, but the adrenaline of the wake-up lingered. They ended up in the living room, curled into opposite ends of the massive velvet sofa, a singular lamp casting long shadows across the floor. "Why did you leave him?" Dom asked quietly. He didn't need to say the name. "Calvin." Grace looked into her tea mug. "He made me feel small," she said, her voice hollow. At first, it was just comments. "You are stupid. You are useless. No one else would want you." Then he started throwing things. Not at me, at the wall, near my head. The day he pushed Ethan. That was the day I left. She looked up at Dom. "I swore I would never let anyone make us feel unsafe again." Dom's jaw tightened. A dark look passed over his face. "He's a fool." "What about you?" Grace asked, turning the spotlight on him. "You mentioned a family business, but you don't talk like a CEO." Dom looked at the fireplace. "I come from a tradition." Grace. "My father, his father. They believed in loyalty above everything. In our world, you protect what is yours, and you don't ask for help from the outside." He paused, choosing his words with surgical care. "We provide structure, protection, for people who can't get it elsewhere, but it requires violence. It demands that you harden yourself until you don't feel the things normal people feel. Until you got on that plane," Grace said softly. Dom looked at her. "Until the plane." The silence between them was heavy with unspoken truths. Grace knew he was editing his story, leaving out the blood and the crimes, but the pain in his voice was real. Suddenly, a sound shattered the night. Crack, crack, crack. It was distant but unmistakable. Gunshots. Then the estate alarms began to scream. Dom moved before Grace could even process the sound. He was off the couch in a blur of motion. The vulnerable, tired father vanished. The dawn appeared, "Stay down," he commanded, his voice pitching low and hard. The door to the living room burst open. 2 of his guards rushed in, weapons drawn, perimeter breach. Marco, the head of security, shouted, "West wall, secure the nursery," Dom barked. "Get Ethan, safe room, now." Grace scrambled up, panic seizing her throat. "Ethan?" "I have him," Dom said, grabbing her arm. "Move, Grace." He pulled her into the hallway. Another guard was already running down the stairs, carrying a sleepy, confused Ethan. Another had Mateo in a portable carrier. Dom herded them all toward a panel in the wall behind the main staircase. He pressed his hand against a scanner, and the panel slid open to reveal a steel door. "Inside," Dom ordered. Grace ran in. Grabbing Ethan from the guard, Dom followed them, taking Mateo's carrier. The heavy steel door hissed shut, sealing them in with a dull thud that cut off the wail of the alarms. The safe room was small, lined with monitors and supplies. The air was recycled and cool. Grace sank onto a bench, pulling Ethan onto her lap. He was trembling. "What is happening?" Ethan whimpered. "Are those fireworks?" "Yes. Baby." Grace lied, her voice shaking. "Just loud fireworks." She looked up at Dom. He was standing by the monitors, watching the grainy feed of the grounds. Men were running. Flashes of light indicated gunfire. Dom turned away from the screen and looked at them. He took a deep breath, forcing his posture to relax. "It is okay," he said, his voice steady. "The wall's held. My men are handling it. You are safe here." But Grace saw it. His hands were shaking. He had clenched them into fists at his sides to hide it, but the tremor was there. He wasn't scared for himself. He was terrified for them. Grace stood up. She left Ethan on the bench with a toy and walked over to Dom. She reached out and placed her hand over his fist. Dom looked down at her hand, then up at her face. His eyes were wild, dilated with adrenaline. "They are trying to get inside," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "Let them try," Grace said fiercely. "You stop them." She took his hand in both of hers, uncurling his fingers. She placed his palm against her chest, right over her heart. It was beating fast, a frantic rabbit rhythm. "Feel that?" she asked. "I am scared, Dom. But I am not alone. Mateo needs the leader who gives orders. But right now, he needs his dad. And I need you." The honesty of it hung in the air. Dom stared at her. The chaotic energy in the room seemed to funnel down into the space between their bodies. He stepped closer. The shaking in his hands stopped, replaced by a tension of a different kind. He looked at her mouth. Grace's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. She wanted him to kiss her. It was insane. In the middle of a siege, but she wanted it more than she had ever wanted anything. Dom raised his free hand. He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his thumb lingering on her cheekbone. His skin was hot. His touch was a caress, gentle and reverent. "Grace." He breathed. He leaned in. Grace tilted her head up, her eyes fluttering shut. Then Ethan spoke from the bench. "Mommy, I am thirsty." Dom froze. He pulled back, blinking as if waking from a trance. He cleared his throat and stepped away, the moment shattering like glass. I have water in the supply cabinet," he said, his voice rough. He turned away, busying himself with bottles, but the air in the room remained thick, charged with the ghost of the kiss that hadn't happened. They stayed in the safe room for 3 hours until the all-clear was given. The next morning, the sun rose over an estate that looked deceptively peaceful, but the tension was a physical weight in the house. Grace walked down the hall toward Dom's study. She needed to know the truth. The vague family business excuse was gone. The door was ajar. She heard voices. It was the Valente syndicate. Marco was saying. His voice was grim. "They were testing the perimeter. They know you have the kid here. Boss, they are sending a message." Dom's voice was cold steel. "If they touch a hair on my son's head, I will burn their entire operation to the ground. Or Grace. If they go near her." Grace pushed the door open. The conversation stopped abruptly. Dom was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk. Marco stood before him. "Grace," Dom said, standing up. "Valente Syndicate," Grace repeated. "That sounds like a mafia movie, Dom." Dom sighed. He signaled Marco to leave. The bodyguard nodded and slipped past Grace, closing the door. Grace walked up to the desk. "Stop lying to me, Dom. No more vague words, no more family tradition. Tell me what you are." Dom looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the steel. She deserved the truth. "I am the head of the Moretti crime family," he said clearly. "The Valentes are my rivals. We are at war. Grace." The words hung there, naked and ugly. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. The safety she had felt, the soft beds, the gates, the guards. It was all an illusion. She was standing in the center of a target. "I have to leave," she whispered. "I have to take Ethan and go." "If you leave now," Dom said, his voice desperate, "you are out in the open. The Valentes know who you are. They know you are with me. If you walk out those gates, you are vulnerable. Here, behind these walls, I have an army." Grace stared at him. She was trapped. Staying meant living in a war zone. Leaving meant being hunted. But as she looked at Dom, the man who had held her hand on the plane, the man who had trembled in the safe room, she realized with a sinking heart that her decision wasn't just about safety anymore. She looked at the man who would burn the city down for her, and she realized she might just let him. The truth had shattered the fragile peace of the estate, leaving sharp edges that Grace Collins was afraid to touch. She stood by the window in the nursery, watching the sun dip below the high stone walls that separated them from the rest of Harbor City. The walls she now knew were not just for show. They were fortifications. Dom stood in the doorway. He had not crossed the threshold, respecting the invisible line she had drawn between them since the revelation in the study. "I need time," Grace said, not turning around. She kept her eyes on the armed guard walking the perimeter of the garden. "I need to think about whether I can keep Ethan here. Knowing what you are." "I understand," Dom said. His voice was low, stripped of the command he usually carried. "I will not push you. Grace, stay as long as you need to feel safe, or to make a plan to leave." Grace turned then. She looked at him, the sharp jaw, the dark eyes that had seen too much violence, and the strange, gentle way he held his hands when he was around her, as if afraid he might break something. "If I stay," Grace asked, her voice trembling slightly, "can you promise me that this war of yours will not touch my son? Can you promise me that?" Dom stepped into the room. He stopped 3 feet from her. "I cannot promise that the world is safe," he said, his tone grave. "But I promise you this. As long as I am breathing, nothing will touch Ethan or Mateo. If death wants them, it will have to go through me first." It was not a comfort, exactly. It was a terrifying vow. But looking at the steel in his eyes, Grace believed him. 2 days later, the intercom at the front gate buzzed with a sound that made everyone jump. Dom was in the kitchen, feeding Mateo a bottle, while Grace wiped down the counters. The domesticity of the scene was so normal it felt like a lie. Marco's voice crackled over the secure line. "Boss, we have a situation at the gate. Is it the Valentes?" Dom asked, his hand instantly going to the small of his back where he kept his weapon concealed. "No," Marco said, sounding baffled. "It is a woman. She says she is from Child Protective Services. She has a badge. She says she has a report about an unsafe environment for a child named Ethan Collins." Grace dropped the dishcloth. It landed with a wet slap on the floor. "Calvin," she whispered. "He did this." Dom's face darkened. He handed Mateo to Grace and strode to the intercom. "Stall her," Dom ordered. "She is threatening to call the police if we do not open the gate," Marco replied. "She says the razor wire looks suspicious." "Let her in," Dom said, rubbing his temples. "If we refuse, they will come back with a warrant and a SWAT team. We cannot have eyes inside the house." He turned to Grace. The panic in his eyes mirrored her own. "Grace, look at me," he said urgently. "They are going to look for any reason to take Ethan, a single mother living in the home of a known businessman with armed guards. It looks unstable. It looks dangerous. So what do we do?" Grace asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We have to control the narrative," Dom said. "We cannot be employer and employee. That looks transient. It looks like you are just staff. We need to be a unit." Grace stared at him. "You want me to lie to a federal agent?" "I want you to save your son," Dom said intensely. "We are partners. We are together. We are raising these boys as a family. Can you do that?" Grace looked at Mateo in her arms, then thought of Ethan, playing in the other room. She thought of Calvin's smirk. "Yes," she said, straightening her spine. "I can do that, Mrs." Gable was a woman who looked like she was made of dried parchment and judgment. She sat on the edge of the velvet sofa in the formal living room, her eyes darting to the security cameras in the corners of the ceiling. "Mr. Moretti," she said, her pen poised over a clipboard. "Miss Collins, the report I received suggests that Miss Collins is in financial distress and has brought her child into a hazardous environment. I see armed men at the gate. That is unusual for a family home." Dom sat beside Grace. He was wearing a casual sweater, looking less like a Don and more like a wealthy suburban dad. But Grace could feel the tension radiating off him. "I have high-profile business interests, Mrs. Gable," Dom said smoothly. "Security is a necessary inconvenience. But inside these walls, we are just a family. Mrs." Gable looked at Grace. "And you, Miss Collins? You are residing here permanently?" Grace took a breath. She reached out and took Dom's hand. His fingers were cold, but they laced with hers instantly, a solid anchor. "Yes," Grace said, forcing a warmth into her voice she didn't feel. "Dominic and I, we've been together for a while. After I lost my apartment, he insisted we move in. He wants to be a father figure to Ethan." "Mrs." Gable raised an eyebrow. "This is a romantic relationship?" Grace looked at Dom. She turned her body toward him, softening her expression. She reached up and adjusted the collar of his sweater, her fingers brushing the warm skin of his neck. "He has been my rock," Grace said softly, looking into Dom's eyes. "I don't know what I would do without him." Dom didn't miss a beat. He rested his free hand on the small of her back, his thumb rubbing soothing circles against her spine. It was a possessive, intimate gesture. "Grace is the one who holds this house together," Dom said, his voice dropping an octave. "She's wonderful with Mateo. My son adores her. We are building a life here." The social worker watched them. She watched the way they leaned into each other. She watched the way Dom's eyes tracked Grace's face, and the way Grace's hand rested naturally on his knee. It didn't look like a lie. The tension in the room began to dissipate, Mrs. Gable asked about bedtimes, about schools, about diet. Grace answered easily, weaving truths into the fabric of their deception. She talked about how Dom burned the onions when he tried to cook. Dom laughed, a genuine, rich sound, and teased her about her obsession with organizing the pantry. By the time Mrs. Gable stood up to leave, her skepticism had thawed. "Well," she said, tucking her clipboard under her arm, "you certainly seem to have a stable support system. Miss Collins, the security is intense, but I can see that the children are loved. I will close the inquiry for now. Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Dom said, shaking her hand. As the front door closed, the silence that rushed back into the foyer was deafening. Grace let out a long, shuddering breath. She leaned back against the heavy oak door, her legs feeling like jelly. "We did it," she whispered. She believed us. She looked at Dom. He was standing close, too close. The performance was over, but the energy between them was still humming, alive and electric. "You were incredible," Dom said. His voice was rough. For a second there. "I forgot we were pretending." Grace let out a nervous laugh. "Yeah, we are good actors." Dom took a step closer. He placed one hand on the wall beside her head, boxing her in. He wasn't touching her, but his presence was overwhelming. He smelled of sandalwood and danger. "Was it just acting, Grace?" he asked quietly. Grace looked up at him. Her heart was beating so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "Dom," she warned, but the word lacked any real force. Dom lowered his head. His other hand moved to her waist, hovering just inches from the fabric of her blouse. "Because when you looked at me in there," he murmured, his eyes searching hers, "when you touched me, I wanted it to be true. I wanted this to be my life, not the war, just you." The admission snapped something inside Grace. The fear, the adrenaline, The weeks of resisting the pull, it all broke. She didn't answer him with words. She reached out, her fingers curling into the front of his sweater, and pulled him down. Dom didn't hesitate. He crashed his mouth onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was hungry. It was desperate. It was the taste of two people who had been standing on the edge of a cliff, finally deciding to jump. Grace gasped against his lips, and Dom used the moment to deepen the kiss. His tongue swept into her mouth, claiming her. His hand on the wall moved to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, tilting her face up to give him better access. Grace arched her back, pressing herself against him. She felt the hard planes of his chest, the heavy buckle of his belt, the sheer power of him. He groaned low in his throat, a guttural sound of want that made her knees buckle. Dom's hand dropped to her waist, pulling her flush against him. There was no space left between them. Grace's hands roamed over his shoulders, gripping the muscle, holding on as the world spun away. For a moment there was no mafia, no custody battle, no threats. There was only the heat of his mouth, the scratch of his stubble against her chin, and the overwhelming, terrifying realization that she wanted him. Dom pulled back slightly, just enough to breathe. His forehead rested against hers. His breathing was ragged. His lips moved to her jawline, pressing hot, open-mouthed kisses down the sensitive column of her throat. Grace, he whispered against her skin. The sound of her name shattered the haze. Grace blinked, her eyes focusing on the chandelier above them. Reality crashed back in. She pushed against his chest. Dom stopped instantly. He pulled back, his eyes dark and blown wide, his chest heaving. "I can't," Grace gasped. Stepping out of the circle of his arms, Dom didn't try to grab her. He stood there, looking at her with a raw vulnerability that hurt to witness. "I am sorry," he said hoarsely. "I shouldn't have—" "No," Grace interrupted, wrapping her arms around herself. "It is not. I wanted to, I wanted to, but I can't afford this. Dom, I can't fall for you." "Why?" Dom asked. "Because you are dangerous," Grace said, her voice breaking. "And because Ethan is the only thing that matters. If I let myself love you, and something happens to you, or if your world hurts him, I would never forgive myself." Dom looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. A sharp, jerky motion. "I understand," he said coldly, the mask slipping back into place. "It won't happen again." He turned and walked away toward his study, leaving Grace standing alone in the foyer, her lips still burning from his kiss. The peace did not last long. The next day, Grace's phone began to blow up. Text messages from unknown numbers, links to social media posts. Calvin had been busy. He hadn't just called CPS. He had been digging. Grace sat at the kitchen island, staring at her phone screen in horror. Calvin had posted on his Facebook page, "My ex-wife is keeping my son in a fortress with a known criminal. Does anyone know Dominic Moretti?" Looking for information, the comments were starting to roll in. People were tagging local news outlets. People were speculating. Then the texts started coming directly to her. "I know who he is. Grace. I know about the indictments in 2015. You are sleeping with the mob? Really? I am going to the cops. I am going to tell them everything. Give me Ethan, and this goes away." Grace's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the phone. Dom walked in, followed by Marco. He took one look at her face and crossed the room in 2 strides. "What is it?" he demanded. Grace held up the phone. Dom read the screen. His face went terrifyingly blank. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Marco," Dom said quietly. "Find him." Marco nodded. "Consider it done." "Boss." Grace jumped up. "No." Dom turned to her. "Grace, he is threatening us. He is threatening to expose my operation. He's putting everyone in this house at risk. You can't hurt him," Grace cried, grabbing Dom's arm. "He's Ethan's father. If you hurt him, if he disappears, Ethan will know. I will know." Dom looked at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. "He's trying to take your son. Grace. He is a rat. In my world. We deal with rats in your world," Grace shouted. "But we are not in your world. Dom, we are in my life. You promised me protection, not a hitman. I'm trying to protect you, Dom roared back, his controls snapping. Do you think I want to do this? Do you think I enjoy violence? I do what is necessary. Violence is not necessary, Grace screamed, tears streaming down her face. There has to be another way. If you kill him, you are exactly what everyone says you are, and I can't have that around my son. They stood chest to chest, breathing hard, the anger and fear swirling around them like a physical storm. Then, a sound cut through the noise. Wah! It was Mateo's cry, coming from the baby monitor on the counter. The sound acted like a bucket of ice water. Dom flinched. He looked at the monitor, then at Grace. The rage drained out of him, leaving him looking old and tired. He stepped back. Go to Mateo, he said quietly. What about Calvin? Grace asked, her voice trembling. Dom turned his back to her. I will not touch him. Tonight. But Grace, if he crosses a line, I cannot promise you I will stand by and watch him destroy us. That night, the house was silent as a tomb. Grace was in the living room, trying to read a book, but the words swam on the page. Her phone sat on the coffee table like a grenade. It buzzed. Grace stared at it. It wasn't a text, it was a voicemail. She picked it up and pressed play, holding it to her ear. Calvin's voice was slurred. He was drunk. Hey, Gracie, nice gate you got there. But kids have to leave the gate sometime, right? School starts at 8:30. Harbor Elementary. Recess is at 10. Accidents happen on playgrounds. Gracie, kids fall. Things break. You bring him to me tomorrow, or maybe I pay a visit to the school, just to say hi. The line clicked dead. Grace dropped the phone. A cold terror washed over her, freezing her blood. It wasn't a legal threat anymore. It was physical. He was threatening to hurt Ethan. She couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. Dom, she didn't remember standing up. She didn't remember running down the hall. She just knew she needed him. She burst into the library where Dom was working. He looked up, startled by her entrance. Grace. Grace stood there, shaking violently, her face pale as a sheet. He knows where he goes to school. She choked out. He said accidents happen. Dom was out of his chair instantly. He crossed the room and caught her just as her legs gave out. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. I have him, he murmured into her hair. I have him. I have you. Grace broke down. She sobbed into his shirt, her hands clutching the fabric of his back. The fear was a tidal wave, drowning her. He's going to hurt him. She wailed. He's going to hurt my baby. Shh, Dom whispered. He stroked her hair with slow, rhythmic motions. No one is going to hurt him. I swear to you. Grace, I will put a team on the school. I will have eyes on Ethan 24/7. Calvin will not get within a mile of him. He held her while she cried, his chin resting on the top of her head. He felt her trembling body against his, and a fierce, dark protectiveness surged through him. It wasn't just duty. It wasn't just because she was Mateo's nanny. He realized, as he held her, that he would burn the entire world to keep her safe. Grace's sobs slowly subsided into quiet hiccups. She didn't pull away. She stayed there, pressed against him, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Dom, she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. I am here, he said. I don't care anymore, she said, lifting her head to look at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, searching his face. I don't care what you have to do. Just keep him safe. Dom looked down at her. He saw the surrender in her eyes. She wasn't asking him to be a better man anymore. She was asking him to be the monster, if that's what it took to save her son. He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. I will, he promised. The fear in the room began to shift. It changed shape, morphing into something else. Grace looked at his lips. The memory of the kiss in the foyer came rushing back, but this time, there was no hesitation. She needed him. Not just his protection, she needed him. Dom felt the shift, too. His hand moved from her hair to her cheek, cupping her face. The way he looked at her wasn't just protective anymore. It was hungry. It was the look of a man who had found the one thing he couldn't live without. Stay with me, he whispered. Just for a minute. Grace nodded. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, closing her eyes, and let the dangerous comfort of his arms swallow her whole. The decision to move Ethan and her mother was the hardest thing Grace had ever done. The safe house was located in an unassuming suburb, a brick colonial that looked perfectly ordinary from the street, but was fortified with bulletproof glass and reinforced doors. Dom called it a precaution. Grace called it a prison. She stood in the foyer of the Moretti estate, her phone pressed to her ear, listening to her mother's confused and frightened voice on the other end. "Mom, please, just stay inside," Grace pleaded, her hand gripping the edge of the antique console table until her knuckles turned white. "Do not open the door for anyone but Marco. Not for pizza. Not for mail. Not for anyone. I don't understand." "Grace," Linda's voice trembled. "There are men with guns in the backyard. Ethan is asking why he can't go to school. What have you gotten us into?" "I am doing this to keep you safe," Grace whispered, guilt twisting like a knife in her gut. "I promise. Mom, it will be over soon." She hung up, feeling like she might vomit. She had dragged her family into the crosshairs of a war they didn't understand. She had chosen this life, chosen Dom, and now the people she loved were paying the price. Dom appeared in the hallway. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes etched deeper than usual. He wore a holster under his arm, a stark reminder that the threat was no longer theoretical. "They are settled?" he asked. His voice low. Grace nodded, unable to speak. "They are safe there." "Grace," Dom said, stepping closer but stopping just short of touching her. "That house is a fortress. My best men are with them." "It shouldn't be necessary," Grace said, her voice cracking. "My 5-year-old is living in a bunker because of me." "Because of Calvin," Dom corrected gently. "And because of the Valentes. You didn't start this fire." "Grace, you are just trying to survive it." The days that followed blurred into a sleepless haze of strategy and fear. The estate became a command center. Dom's study, once a place of quiet reading, was now covered in maps of Harbor City, financial schematics of the Valente operations, and legal documents regarding the custody battle. Grace refused to sit on the sidelines. She sat across from Dom at the massive oak desk, poring over bank statements and legal briefs. She knew Calvin's patterns, his weaknesses. She knew where he hid his money when he was trying to dodge alimony. "Look at this," she said late one Tuesday night, pointing to a highlighted line on a bank statement. "Calvin made 3 withdrawals of $5,000 in cash last week. He never uses cash. He says it leaves no paper trail, but he is terrible at math." Dom leaned over her shoulder to look. "He smells like espresso and gun oil," a scent that had become strangely comforting to her. "He is paying someone off," Dom murmured, "or buying information." Their shoulders brushed as he leaned in. It was a fleeting contact, but in the high-stress vacuum of the room, it felt electric. Grace didn't pull away. She could feel the heat radiating from him. Dom's hand rested on the table next to hers. His fingers were long and scarred, resting on the paper she was holding. He didn't move his hand, he just let it stay there, an anchor in the storm. "We will find out who he is paying," Dom said, his voice dropping to a rumble that vibrated in her chest, "and we will shut it down." Grace looked up at him. His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the stubble darkening his jaw. The air between them was thick, charged with the fear of what was coming and the undeniable, magnetic pull of their shared orbit. "Thank you," she whispered. Dom looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes. He looked like he wanted to say something that had nothing to do with bank statements or hitmen, but he pulled back, clearing his throat. "Keep digging," he said gruffly. "We need everything you have got." 2 nights later, the silence of the house was heavy. The boys were gone, Ethan at the safe house, and Mateo finally asleep in the nursery after a fussy evening. Grace walked into the kitchen. Her eyes felt like they were filled with sand. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the blue flame flickering in the dim light. She turned around and found Dom standing in the doorway. He had taken off his holster and his tie. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the hollow of his throat. He looked stripped down, defenseless. "Tea?" Grace asked softly. "Please," Dom said. He walked over and leaned against the counter opposite her. He watched her work, his gaze heavy and unblinking. Grace poured 2 mugs of chamomile. She handed one to him. Their fingers brushed as he took the cup. And this time, neither of them pulled back. Dom wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic, but his eyes stayed on her face. "I am tired, Grace," he admitted. The words came out of him like a sigh he had been holding for 10 years. "Tired of the Valentes?" Grace asked, leaning back against the sink. "Tired of the noise," Dom said. He looked around the shadow-filled kitchen. "I grew up in this. The shouting, the looking over your shoulder, the violence. I thought if I became the boss, I could control it. I could make it orderly." He took a sip of tea, grimacing slightly at the heat. "But it is just chaos with better suits," he said. "I spend my life fighting wars I didn't start, and then I come in here. And I see you holding Mateo, or I see you highlighting tax returns to save your son." He set the mug down on the counter with a soft clink. "And for the first time in my life, I don't want to be the boss," he whispered. "I just want to be the man standing in the kitchen with you." Grace felt her heart stop, then restart with a frantic, thudding rhythm. The walls she had built to protect herself, the reminders that he was dangerous, that she was just the nanny, crumbled into dust. She stepped closer. The space between them vanished. "Dom," she breathed. He reached out. He cupped her face in both of his large, warm hands. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, tracing the line of her jaw. He looked into her eyes, searching, asking a question without speaking a word. Grace didn't turn away. She tilted her head into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. It was all the permission he needed. Dom lowered his head and kissed her. This wasn't like the kiss in the foyer, the one born of performance and desperation. This was slow. It was honest. It was the taste of a man who was starving and a woman who had finally found sustenance. Grace made a low sound in her throat and stepped into him. Her hands came up to grip his forearms, feeling the corded muscle beneath the rolled-up sleeves. Dom groaned, a vibration she felt against her lips, and pulled her closer. His arms went around her waist, locking her against his body. They kissed with a deep, aching intensity. Dom's mouth was firm and demanding, but tender. He tasted of tea and longing. Grace opened to him, her tongue meeting his, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, then to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his short hair. The kitchen dissolved. The war outside ceased to exist. There was only the heat of his body, the roughness of his hands moving over her back, pressing her closer as if he could merge them into one person. They broke apart for air, but they didn't let go. Grace leaned back against the counter, and Dom followed her. Pressing his body along the length of hers, he rested his forehead against hers, their breathing ragged and synced in the quiet room. Dom's hand moved to her spine. He traced the vertebrae through her thin shirt, a slow, mesmerizing pattern that made her shiver. "I am scared," Grace whispered, her eyes closed. "I know," Dom murmured against her skin. "I am too, but I am right here," she said. "I am not going anywhere." Dom pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were dark, dilated, filled with a fierce, possessive light. "We are in this together," he said. "You and me?" "Yeah," Grace whispered. "You and me." The shatter came an hour later. Grace was still in the kitchen, rinsing the mugs, feeling a fragile, terrifying kind of happiness blooming in her chest. Dom had gone to check the perimeter one last time. The back door burst open. Marco stumbled in. He was breathless, his face the color of ash. He wasn't looking at Grace. He was looking for Dom. "Boss!" Marco shouted, his voice cracking. Dom materialized from the hallway instantly, his gun already in his hand. "What?" Dom barked. Marco looked at Dom, then at Grace. The look on his face stopped Grace's heart cold. "The safe house," Marco gasped. "They hit the safe house." Grace dropped the mug she was holding. It shattered on the floor, shards of ceramic exploding across the tile. "Ethan," she choked out. "The security team was compromised," Marco said rapidly, the words tumbling out. "They used a delivery truck." "A bomb at the gate," They got inside. "Where are they?" Dom demanded, grabbing Marco by the lapels of his jacket. "Where are my boys? They are gone," Marco said. "Linda." "Your mother." "Grace." "She was at the door. They knocked her down. She's at the hospital. She's battered but alive." Grace let out a scream that tore her throat raw. It was a primal, animal sound of pure terror. She collapsed, her legs simply refusing to hold her up. "Grace." Dom was there before she hit the floor. He caught her, pulling her into his chest as she thrashed, screaming her son's name. "Ethan, Mateo. No, no, no." "Shh, Grace, shh," Dom said, but his voice was shaking. He held her tightly, his arms like iron bands, rocking her back and forth on the kitchen floor amidst the broken pottery. "What about the message?" Marco asked, his voice low. Dom looked up. His face changed, the tenderness vanished, replaced by a mask of cold. Absolute death. "What message?" Dom asked. "They left a burner phone," Marco said, "and a note. It said, 'Trade the kingdom for the heirs.'" Dom stood up, pulling Grace with him. He held her steady, forcing her to look at him. "Grace, listen to me," he said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "I need you to breathe. They took him." Grace sobbed, clutching his shirt. "They have my baby. They have Mateo." "I know," Dom said, "and I am going to get them back." He turned to Marco. "Call everyone," Dom ordered. "Every soldier, every earner, every contact on the street. I want the city locked down. No one leaves. No one enters. If a Valente breathes in Harbor City tonight, I want to know about it." He looked back at Grace. His eyes were burning with a cold blue fire. "I am going to burn this city to the ground," he vowed through clenched teeth. "I will tear it apart brick by brick until I find them." The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. The estate transformed from a home into a war room. Men in tactical gear flooded the hallways. Computer screens were set up on the dining room table. Grace sat at the head of the table. She had stopped crying. The terror had calcified into something hard and sharp in her chest. She was looking at a map of the warehouse district. "Marco," she said, her voice raspy but clear. "Calvin used to work down by the docks. Before he got fired, he knows the loading schedules." Dom looked at her from across the table where he was loading a magazine into a handgun. "Check the old shipping logs." Dom ordered his tech guy. "Look for properties owned by shell companies linked to Calvin's old boss. I found something." The tech guy shouted a moment later. A warehouse on Pier 42 was abandoned 3 years ago, but the power grid just showed a spike in usage an hour ago. "That is it," Dom said. He racked the slide of his gun. "Gear up. We move in 10 minutes. He walked over to Grace. "You stay here," he said. "It is going to be a war zone." "No," Grace said. She stood up. She wasn't asking. "Grace." Dom started. "They are my children," Grace said. "Ethan is scared of the dark. Mateo needs his specialized formula, or he gets sick. I am not sitting here drinking tea while my son is in a warehouse with monsters. I am coming." Dom looked at her. He saw the same fierce determination he had seen on the plane. She wasn't a civilian anymore. She was a mother protecting her young. He nodded once. "Get her a vest," he told Marco, "and keep her in the car until I say clear." The ride to the docks was silent. The black SUV sped through the sleeping city, running red lights, a convoy of death moving toward the water. Grace sat in the back seat next to Dom. She was wearing a Kevlar vest that was too heavy for her frame. Her hands were shaking in her lap. Dom reached out and took her hand. His grip was crushing. Grace looked at him. In the flickering light of the street lamps passing by, he looked like a statue carved from granite, but his eyes were human. They were filled with fear. Not for himself, but for what he might find in that warehouse. He lifted her hand to his lips. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a lingering, desperate gesture. "Grace," he whispered. "Yeah?" she asked. If things go sideways," Dom said, staring straight ahead. "If I don't walk out of there—" "Don't," Grace said. "Listen to me," Dom commanded softly. "If I don't walk out, Marco has instructions. There is a plane waiting at the private airfield. Money. New identities. You take the boys and you go. You survive." Grace stared at him in horror. He was saying goodbye. He was planning to trade his life for theirs. "You are coming back," she hissed, gripping his hand with both of hers. "You promised me." "Dom, you said we were in this together." "I am going to get them back," Dom said. "That is the only promise that matters." The car slowed. "We are here," Marco said from the front seat. Dom released her hand. He checked his weapon one last time. The door lock clicked open. "Stay down," Dom told her. "Wait for the signal." He looked at her one last time, a look of profound love and regret, and then he opened the door and stepped out into the darkness. Moving toward the warehouse where their children were waiting, Grace watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She waited exactly 3 seconds. Then, she opened her door. She wasn't staying in the car. The black SUV rolled to a silent stop 3 blocks from the decaying industrial skeleton of Pier 42. The air smelled of salt water and rotting wood, a damp chill that seeped through the layers of clothing Grace wore. She shifted in her seat, the unfamiliar weight of the Kevlar vest pressing against her chest. It was heavy, stiff, and terrifyingly real. "Stay close to me," Dom said. His voice was no longer the warm baritone that had whispered to her in the kitchen. It was the voice of a commander going to war. "Until I say move. You are a statue. Do you understand?" Grace nodded. She couldn't trust her voice. They moved out into the darkness. Dom's men, shadows in tactical gear, fanned out into the alleyways, disappearing like smoke. Dom kept Grace tucked behind him, his body a solid shield against the unknown. They crept toward the looming shape of the warehouse, the silence of the night stretching tight until it felt like it would snap. Suddenly, a deafening boom shattered the quiet at the front of the building. A fireball erupted near the main loading bay, sending orange light flaring into the sky. "Now," Marco hissed, appearing from the darkness at their side. Dom didn't hesitate. He signaled Marco to take the lead, while the guards at the front were distracted by the explosion. Marco guided Grace toward a rusted side entrance that had been pried open just enough to slip through. Dom stopped at the door. "I am going to draw their fire to the main hall," he whispered to Grace, his hands gripping her shoulders for a brief, hard second. "You get the boys. You get them out. Come back to me," Grace whispered. Dom didn't answer. He turned and vanished into the gloom of the warehouse floor, his weapon drawn. Grace followed Marco into a narrow corridor that smelled of oil and dust. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, loud enough, she feared, to give them away. "Clear," Marco murmured, checking a corner. They reached a heavy metal door. Marco listened for a second, then nodded to Grace. "Inside," he mouthed. Grace pushed the door open. The room was a small office, lit by a single flickering bulb. 2 men were standing near the window, looking out at the chaos at the front of the building, their weapons held loosely. In the corner, on a filthy mattress, huddled 2 small shapes. Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan?" she whispered. The men spun around, raising their guns, but Marco was faster. 2 suppressed shots coughed from his weapon, sharp spits of sound. The men crumpled before they could shout. "Mommy!" Ethan screamed. Scrambling up, Grace crossed the room in a blur. She fell to her knees, scooping Ethan into her arms. He was shaking violently, his face streaked with tears and grime. Next to him, Matteo was sitting in his carrier, his eyes wide and glassy with fear. "I am here. Baby, I am here," Grace sobbed, pulling Ethan tight while she reached for Matteo. She unbuckled the baby with trembling fingers and pulled him against her chest, holding both of them as if she could absorb their terror into her own body. "We have to move," Marco said urgently, watching the door. "The boss has engaged them." As if on cue, the sound of automatic gunfire erupted from the main hall. It was a terrifying, thunderous noise that made the floorboards vibrate. Grace stood up, clutching Matteo to her chest with one arm and gripping Ethan's hand with the other. "Stay behind me, Ethan. Hold on tight." They moved back into the corridor, but the path to the exit was blocked by shouting men running toward the fight. "This way," Marco directed, shoving them toward the main hall's upper catwalk. It was the only way around. Grace looked down into the cavernous main space of the warehouse. It was a scene from a nightmare. Muzzle flashes lit up the dark corners like strobe lights. Dom was moving through the chaos like a storm. He wasn't taking cover. He was advancing. He moved with a brutal, terrifying precision. His face a mask of cold fury. This wasn't the man who burnt onions in her kitchen. This was the monster he had warned her about, but he was a monster fighting for his children. "Dom!" Grace screamed. Unable to stop herself, Dom looked up. He saw her on the catwalk. For a split second, distraction flickered in his eyes. In that second, a man stepped out from the shadows of the loading cranes. It was the Valente leader, a man Grace recognized from the police files on Dom's desk. And behind him, cowering in the shadows, was Calvin. Her ex-husband looked small and pathetic, clutching a briefcase, his eyes darting around looking for an exit. "Well, look at this family reunion," the Valente leader shouted, his voice echoing over the dying gunfire. Dom froze. He was out in the open, his gun leveled at the leader. "Let them go, Sal," Dom said. His voice carried across the distance, calm and deadly. "This is between us. It became about them when you decided to play house." Sal sneered. He raised his weapon. "But the real tragedy is the betrayal, isn't it?" He gestured to Calvin. "Your boy here told us everything." Sal laughed. He wanted his kid back. He said the great Dominic Moretti had gone soft, that he was distracted by a pretty piece of skirt. Grace felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She looked at Calvin. He couldn't even meet her eyes. He had sold them out. He had put a gun to his own son's head because he was jealous and greedy. "Calvin," Grace breathed, the name tasting like ash. "I just wanted full custody." "Grace," Calvin shouted up at her, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You were putting him in danger. You brought him to a slaughterhouse," Grace screamed back. Sal raised his gun. He wasn't aiming at Dom. He was aiming up at the catwalk, at Grace, at the boys. "Say goodbye, Moretti." Sal grinned. Dom didn't shoot. He didn't shout. He moved. As Sal pulled the trigger, Dom threw himself into the line of fire. He didn't dive for cover. He dove in front of the trajectory of the bullet intended for the catwalk. The shot cracked through the air. Dom's body jerked violently in mid-air. A spray of red mist erupted from his shoulder. He hit the concrete floor hard, rolling with the momentum. "No!" Grace screamed, the sound tearing her throat. "Dom!" Ethan shrieked. Grace grabbed the boys, dragging them down behind a stack of metal crates. She covered their bodies with her own, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the end. But the end didn't come. From the floor, bleeding and broken, Dom pushed himself up. He lifted his weapon with his good hand. His eyes were focused on Sal, who was laughing, preparing for the kill shot. Dom didn't hesitate. He fired once. The shot hit Sal directly in the center of his chest. The laughter cut off instantly. The leader dropped like a stone. Silence crashed into the warehouse. The remaining Valente men, seeing their leader dead and the Moretti enforcers closing in, threw down their weapons. Dom slumped back against a crate, clutching his shoulder. Blood was pouring between his fingers, dark and slick. "Grace," he rasped. Grace scrambled up. She ignored Marco's warning. She picked up Mateo, grabbed Ethan, and ran down the metal stairs. She sprinted across the floor, sliding to her knees beside Dom. "Dom, Dom, look at me!" she sobbed, pressing her hand over his wound to staunch the flow. Dom looked up at her. His face was gray, sweat beading on his forehead, but he smiled, a weak, jagged smile. "Are they okay?" he whispered. "They are fine," Grace cried, tears dripping onto his face. "You saved them! You idiot! You saved them!" Sirens began to wail in the distance. Not one or two, dozens. The sound grew louder with every second, closing in from all sides. Dom's eyes widened. "The police! I called them!" Grace confessed, her voice shaking. "Before we came in. I called 911. I couldn't let this keep going. Dom, I wanted it to end." Dom looked at her. For a moment, she thought he would be furious. He was a crime boss. Calling the cops was the ultimate betrayal, but Dom just let out a long breath. He reached up with his bloody hand and touched her cheek. "Good," he whispered. "What?" Grace blinked. "I have files." "Grace," Dom rasped, wincing as the pain spiked. "In the safe. Evidence on the Valentes, on the judges they bought, on the dirty cops. I have been saving it for an insurance policy." He looked toward the warehouse doors, where blue and red lights were starting to flash against the windows. "I can trade it," he said. "I can give them the syndicate. I can give them everything." "But you will go to prison," Grace whispered, realizing what he was saying. "Better a prison cell than a coffin," Dom said. "And if I am inside, the war ends. You are safe. The boys are safe." The doors burst open. SWAT teams flooded the room, shouting orders. "Police, get down, hands in the air." Dom looked at Marco. "Get them out the back," he ordered. "Now!" "No!" Grace clung to his jacket. "I am not leaving you. You have to," Dom said intensely. His eyes locked onto hers, burning with a fierce, terrifying love. "Grace, you have to survive. For Ethan, for Mateo, be a mother." He shoved her gently toward Marco. "Go!" Marco grabbed Grace's arm, pulling her up. "Come on, Grace, we have to go." Grace stumbled back, clutching Mateo, Ethan clinging to her leg. She watched as the police surrounded Dom. She saw him slowly raise his good hand and his bloody hand into the air. She saw him surrender. Just before the officers swarmed him, Dom turned his head and he looked at her one last time. His eyes said everything he couldn't say. "I love you. I'm sorry. I will come back." Then, the wall of uniforms closed in, and he was gone. The months that followed were a blur of courtrooms and flashbulbs. Grace stood on the witness stand, her back straight, her voice unwavering. She told the jury everything. She told them about the Valente syndicate. She told them about the kidnapping. And with a cold, hard satisfaction, she told them about Calvin's role in it all. She watched from the gallery as Calvin was sentenced to 15 years for conspiracy and child endangerment. He didn't look at her as he was led away. Then came Dom's hearings. Grace sat in the front row every single day. She listened as the prosecutors read the list of charges, but she also listened as Dom's lawyer presented the deal. Dominic Moretti had turned state's evidence. He had dismantled the entire organized crime network of Harbor City from the inside out. He had handed over corrupt politicians and violent enforcers because of his cooperation, and because of the undeniable fact that he had taken a bullet to save 2 children. The judge was lenient. Not life, 7 years. With a possibility of parole in 4. It was a long time. But it wasn't forever. Grace built a life in the space between those years. She moved into a small house in the suburbs, nothing like the estate, but safe. She went back to school online. She took Ethan to soccer practice. She raised Mateo as if he were her own flesh and blood. And every Saturday, they drove 2 hours to the Federal Correctional Facility upstate. The visiting room became their living room. Ethan would press his drawings against the glass partition, excitedly telling Dom about his week. Mateo, growing from a baby into a toddler, learned to recognize the man in the gray jumpsuit. Dom changed in there. The hardness around his eyes softened. He lost the tan, but he gained a quiet kind of peace. He wasn't a general fighting a war anymore. He was just a man paying his debt. "Wait for me," he would say at the end of every visit, his hand pressed against the glass opposite hers. "I am not going anywhere," Grace would promise. 4 years later, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Grace parked the used SUV in the waiting lot of the facility. Her heart was doing flip-flops in her chest, making her feel like a teenager on a first date. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. She was older. There were fine lines around her eyes now. But she looked happy. "Are we getting Dad?" Mateo asked from the back seat. He was 4 now, a ball of energy with Dom's dark curls. "Yes." "Leo," Grace smiled. "We are getting Dad." The heavy steel gate buzzed and slid open. A man walked out. He was carrying a single duffel bag. He wore jeans and a white t-shirt, clothes Grace had sent him a week ago. He stopped just outside the gate, blinking in the harsh sunlight. He took a deep breath of free air. "Dom." Grace opened the car door. "Daddy," the boys didn't wait, and they scrambled out of the car and sprinted across the pavement. Dom dropped his bag. He fell to his knees just as they collided with him. He wrapped his arms around them, burying his face in their necks. He held them tight, rocking back and forth, laughter shaking his shoulders. Grace hung back. She leaned against the car door, watching them. Her vision blurred with tears. She let them have their moment, the father and his sons. After a long time, Dom stood up. He kept a hand on each boy's shoulder, but his eyes lifted. He found Grace. He walked toward her. He moved differently now. The heavy, burdened walk of the dawn was gone. He walked like a man who owned nothing but was rich in everything that mattered. He stopped a foot away from her. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," Grace whispered. Dom reached out. His hands, rough and warm, cupped her face. He looked at her as if he were memorizing her all over again. "I am just a guy now." "Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No money, no soldiers, no estate, just an ex-con with a bad shoulder. Are you sure you still want this?" Grace didn't answer with words. She stepped into his space. She wrapped her arms around his neck, smelling the soap and the sunshine on his skin. She pulled him down and kissed him. It was a kiss that tasted of freedom. It was grounded and passionate, carrying the weight of every lonely night, every terrifying moment, and every hope they had held on to for 4 long years. "I don't want the boss," Grace whispered against his lips. "I just want you." Dom let out a shuddering breath and buried his face in her hair. "Let's go home." The flight was smooth, cruising at 30,000 feet above the clouds. They were heading west to visit Grace's mother for Thanksgiving. The cabin was quiet, most passengers dozing in the afternoon sun. In row 12, Mateo, tired from the excitement of the trip, started to fuss. He kicked the seat in front of him and let out a whine that quickly escalated into a cry. A few passengers nearby shifted, casting annoyed glances over the seats. A woman in the aisle across from them sighed loudly. Dom stiffened. Old reflexes died hard. For a split second, panic flared in his eyes. He looked at the crying boy, then at the passengers, his body tensing as if preparing for a fight. But before he could say a word, Grace moved. She unbuckled her seatbelt. She reached over and unbuckled Mateo, lifting the 4-year-old into her lap. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, smoothing his hair back. "It is just your ears. Look at me." She smiled at him, that soft, radiant smile that had stopped a war in a diner years ago. She started to hum, a low, vibrating melody. She rubbed his back in slow, rhythmic circles. Mateo sniffled. He looked at his mother. He laid his head on her chest and closed his eyes. Within seconds, the crying stopped. The cabin remained peaceful. Dom watched her. He watched the way her hand moved on their son's back. He watched the sunlight catching the gold band on her finger, a simple ring they had bought at a pawn shop 2 weeks ago. Grace looked up and caught him staring. She raised an eyebrow. "What?" she mouthed. Dom smiled. He reached across the armrest and took her hand, interlacing their fingers. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "Nothing," he whispered, leaning his head back against the seat, finally at peace. "Just remembering the day you did the unthinkable." Grace squeezed his hand. "You mean the day I kidnapped your baby?" Dom closed his eyes, a contented smile playing on his lips. "No, the day you saved his father," as the plane banked toward the horizon, heading for a future where the only thing that would ever keep them up at night was a child's cry. Dom Moretti finally slept. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Dom and Grace. I hope you enjoyed this journey of danger, redemption, and love. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment down below and tell me where you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this series, please make sure to subscribe to Mafia Romance Stories so you never miss an episode. Share your thoughts on the ending in the comments. Did Dom redeem himself? Let me know. Until next time.